There is a particular weight to a ring that has outlived the hand it was made for, a weight that has nothing to do with carats or gold. And I didn't understand that weight the way I understand it now, until the evening I stood in my own kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, listening to a stranger's voice on the phone describe, in careful, professional detail, exactly how my late wife's wedding ring had ended up sitting in a glass case under fluorescent light on Broughton Street, $40 short of being sold to whoever walked through the door next. My name is Thomas Caldwell. Everyone calls me Tom. I'm 63 years old. I taught American history at a public high school here for 31 years before retiring 2 years ago, the same year, as it happens, that I buried my wife Eleanor after a 14-month fight with pancreatic cancer. I want to tell you about that ring before I tell you what happened to it, because I don't think the second part of this story means anything if you don't understand the weight of the first. Eleanor's engagement ring had belonged to her grandmother, Marguerite, a woman I never met, who wore it through the Depression and a marriage that lasted 51 years on a tobacco farm outside Statesboro, and who had it resized twice in her lifetime, once for her own hand and once, decades later, for Eleanor's. The summer Eleanor turned 22 and Marguerite, dying slowly of her own age, decided she'd rather watch her granddaughter wear it than have it sit in a box. Inside the band, in script so small you needed good light and better eyes than mine to read it clearly, was engraved a single line: held, not owned. Eleanor used to run her thumb over that inscription when she was thinking hard about something, a habit so constant across our 38 years of marriage that I can still see the specific motion of it if I close my eyes, her thumb moving in that small, unconscious circle, while she worked out a lesson plan or a grocery list, or, in the final year, the considerably harder arithmetic of how much time she believed she actually had left. I taught American history for 31 years, and Eleanor taught elementary music for 29 of them, at a school not 3 miles from mine, and I think part of why our marriage worked as well as it did was a shared, professional patience with slow, incremental things. A lesson plan built over a semester, a fourth-grade choir gradually learning to hold a harmony, the specific discipline of trusting that meaningful progress rarely announces itself all at once. That same patience carried us through her final 14 months more gracefully than I think either of us expected, Eleanor insisting, even in her hardest weeks, on grading a final stack of student compositions from her hospital bed, her thumb finding the ring's inscription in the pauses between one student's uneven violin fingering and the next. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think, and we're nowhere near the end of this one. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and I promise you this one has more turns in it than you're expecting. Now let's get back to it. I kept the ring, after Eleanor died, in a small cedar box on my dresser, not locked away in a safe deposit box the way a more careful man might have done, because some part of me needed it near me, needed to be able to open that box on the specific evenings when the house felt too large and too quiet, and hold something Eleanor had held every day for 38 years. I want you to understand that this ring was never, in my mind, an asset. It was the closest thing I had left to the physical fact of her hand. The house on Habersham Street, where Eleanor and I raised our 2 daughters and grew old together, has a particular quality of quiet in the evenings. A Savannah quiet made of live oak leaves shifting against the windows, and the distant, muffled hum of a city that never quite settles all the way down. And I have spent 2 years learning the specific shape of that quiet without her voice inside it. Some evenings I could open the cedar box and simply look at the ring, the small sapphire beside the diamond catching whatever light was left in the room, and feel, for a few minutes, considerably less alone than the rest of the house allowed. Other evenings I couldn't bring myself to open it at all, leaving it closed on the dresser like something too fragile to be handled on a night when my own hands weren't steady enough to be trusted with it. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and I promise you this one has more turns in it than you're expecting. Now let's get back to it. My nephew Dominic, Dom, everyone calls him, is 27 years old, my sister Patricia's only son, and he'd been close to Eleanor in a way that went beyond the ordinary fondness between an aunt and a nephew. Eleanor helped raise him, in a real sense, through the 2 difficult years after Patricia's divorce when Dom was 11 and 12, staying with us most weekends while Patricia worked double shifts to keep their household afloat. And Eleanor had a specific tenderness toward Dom that I think came from watching him grow up under circumstances neither of us thought a boy that age should have to carry alone. I remember those weekends with a specific fondness of my own. Eleanor teaching Dom to make her mother's pecan pie in our kitchen on Habersham Street, the 2 of them arguing cheerfully about whether the crust needed another minute in the oven. Eleanor letting him win those arguments considerably more often than his actual culinary judgment probably deserved. She used to take him to the Bonaventure Cemetery on Sunday afternoons, an odd tradition for an 11-year-old, but one Dom apparently found strangely comforting, walking among the old moss-draped headstones while Eleanor told him stories about the people buried there, real and invented in roughly equal measure, until he couldn't always tell which was which and, I suspect, didn't especially want to know. He called her Aunt El. He was one of 6 people who spoke at her funeral, and I remember, standing at the back of that church, watching him describe a specific Christmas Eve tradition Eleanor had built just for the 2 of them, a particular ornament she let him hang first every single year, an old glass bird that had belonged to her own mother, understanding, in that moment, that whatever grief I was carrying, Dom was carrying a real, considerable version of it too. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops being simple. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops being simple. The conversation that started everything happened on a Sunday afternoon in April, almost exactly 2 years after Eleanor's death, at my own kitchen table, over coffee Dom had made because he'd started coming by most Sundays that year. A specific, quiet kindness I'd come to genuinely depend on more than I let myself admit out loud. Those Sunday visits had become, without either of us ever formally naming them as such, a kind of mutual grief maintenance. Dom checking in on his uncle, certainly, but also, I understood only much later, quietly checking in on himself, using the ritual of our coffee and conversation as an anchor point in weeks that were, I now know, growing increasingly turbulent underneath the surface he showed me. That particular Sunday, the azaleas along my back fence were finally past their peak bloom, dropping pink petals across the patio in the specific, brief window savanna spring allows before the real heat sets in. And I mentioned, in passing, that my insurance agent had called that week reminding me my homeowner's policy hadn't had its jewelry riders updated in nearly a decade, and that Eleanor's ring, given how much gold and diamond prices had climbed since Marguerite first had it appraised in the 90s, was probably insured for a fraction of its actual current value. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. Dom's face did something specific when I said that, a kind of quick, focused attention I registered at the time as simple helpfulness and understand now, looking back, as something considerably more complicated. I've replayed that specific expression more times than I want to admit over the past year, trying to decide, honestly, whether I actually saw desperation in it at the time and simply chose not to name it, or whether I'm only imagining it now, retroactively, the way memory sometimes rearranges itself around a truth it didn't have access to in the moment. I don't fully trust my own answer to that question even now. I could take it in for you, he said. I know a jeweler on Whitaker Street does appraisals for insurance purposes all the time, honest guy, won't try to upsell you on anything. You hate crowds now, Uncle Tom, I know you do, and that shop gets busy on weekends. Let me handle it. I'll have it back to you by the weekend. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I want to be honest about why I said yes, because I think the honesty matters. It wasn't only that Dom's offer solved a genuine, practical avoidance of mine. The specific way grief had reshaped my relationship to crowded public spaces since Eleanor died, a small but real limitation I'd never fully explained to anyone except in the vaguest. It was also, I think, that handing Dom the ring felt in that moment like a way of extending Eleanor's own tenderness toward him one more time, a small act of trust that felt like something she herself would have wanted me to offer. I went upstairs, opened the cedar box on my dresser, and placed Marguerite's ring, the one withheld, not owned, engraved in script too small to read without good light, into my nephew's open palm. He was gone with it by 4 that afternoon. I did not see that ring again for considerably longer than a weekend. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to walk you through the specific texture of the following 3 weeks, because I think the slow, mounting unease of that stretch matters as much as anything that happened at the end of it. Dom didn't return the ring that first weekend. When I texted him Sunday evening, he told me the jeweler had found something interesting in the setting that needed a closer look, a specific gemological detail worth documenting properly for the insurance file, and that it would take a few more days. I believed him without hesitation, because why wouldn't I? And because 3 decades of teaching history had made me, I think, a person genuinely inclined to trust the people I love until given a real reason not to. I want to describe the specific quality of that first week without the ring in the house, because I noticed its absence in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I found myself, twice that week, opening the cedar box on my dresser out of pure habit before remembering it was empty, a small, specific jolt each time, the box's velvet interior sitting there catching lamplight with nothing to hold. I told myself this was ordinary, that I was simply unaccustomed to the ring being out of the house, and that the discomfort would fade once Dom brought it back with a proper appraisal in hand, a piece of paper that would let me finally sleep a little easier about what would happen to Marguerite's ring after I myself was gone. The following week, when I asked again, Dom told me the jeweler had actually recommended a specialist antique appraiser, someone with more specific expertise in early 20th century settings, and that he'd taken the ring to a second location himself, out near Pooler, to get a more thorough documentation done, the kind that would genuinely justify updating my insurance coverage to reflect its full historical and material value. I remember feeling, at that point, a small, specific flicker of something I didn't yet have language for, not suspicion exactly, more a kind of quiet, unexamined discomfort that I chose, that week, to set aside rather than sit with. I busied myself instead with the ordinary architecture of a retired man's week. A Wednesday spent reorganizing the garage, a Friday lunch with 2 old colleagues from the history department, Small, deliberate distractions that let the discomfort sit in the back of my mind without ever quite reaching the front of it. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. By the third week, the flicker had become something I could no longer talk myself out of. Dom's texts had grown shorter, vaguer, arriving later in the day than his usual prompt responses, and when I called him directly on a Thursday evening, he picked up sounding distracted in a way that was entirely unlike him, telling me the appraisal was basically done, and he'd bring the ring by soon, a specific vagueness that landed, that particular evening, with a weight it hadn't carried in the first 2 weeks. I sat with that phone call for a long time afterward, staring at nothing in particular in my own dim kitchen, feeling the specific, cold beginning of a fear I still didn't have a name for. I did not know, that Thursday evening, that I was going to receive a phone call 4 days later that would give that fear its exact, devastating name. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what I heard on that call is not what you're expecting. The call came on a Monday afternoon, from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail the way I do with most unfamiliar numbers, except that something, some small, unaccountable instinct, made me answer it instead. I was standing at my kitchen counter. I remember, a cup of coffee gone cold in front of me, sunlight coming through the window over the sink in the specific slanted way it does in a Savannah afternoon in late spring, and I picked up the phone with the ordinary, distracted attention of a man expecting a robocall about his car's extended warranty. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Inez Delacroix, the owner of a pawn and jewelry shop on Broughton Street called Delacroix Fine Pawn, and I want to describe her voice specifically, because it carried a particular careful, professional gravity that told me, before she'd finished her first full sentence, that whatever she was about to tell me was not a sales call or a wrong number. There was a specific measured quality to how she spoke, the voice of someone who had clearly made this exact kind of call before and had learned, through practice, exactly how to deliver difficult information without letting the person on the other end panic before they'd heard the whole picture. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Mr. Caldwell, she said, I want to start by telling you that nothing illegal has happened here, and I'm not calling to alarm you unnecessarily. But 3 weeks ago, our shop's registration system flagged an item brought in for consignment against a jewelry appraisal database our industry uses for high-value antique pieces, and the flag came back with your name on the original insurance documentation from 1994. I need to ask you directly. Did you authorize anyone to sell or consign a ring with the interior engraving held, not owned? If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe the specific, physical sensation of hearing that inscription read back to me by a stranger's voice. A sentence Eleanor's thumb had traced 10,000 times in 38 years of marriage, now sitting inside a computer database somewhere. Flagged, cross-referenced, treated as data rather than as the last physical trace of a woman I still, 2 years later, reached for in my sleep some nights before remembering she wasn't there. There is a specific kind of vertigo that comes from hearing something intensely private spoken back to you in an entirely impersonal register, and I felt that vertigo standing at my own kitchen counter, the cold coffee in front of me, the slanted afternoon light suddenly seeming considerably harsher than it had a moment earlier. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone with a hand that had gone, I noticed distantly, slightly unsteady, and I told Inez de Lacroix, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, no. I had not authorized that. I had authorized an appraisal. I had not authorized a sale. I remember the specific effort it took to keep my voice level as I said it, the way grief and fresh alarm can occupy exactly the same register in a person's chest, indistinguishable from the outside, both of them pressing against the same tight place beneath the sternum. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Inez explained, carefully, exactly what her registration system had done and why. And I want to describe the mechanics of it, because I think it matters for understanding how this story ended the way it did rather than considerably worse. Eleanor and I had, back in 1994, following Marguerite's death and the ring's formal transfer to Eleanor, had it appraised and registered with the Savannah Jewelers Guild's Antique Documentation Service, a specific, formal process Eleanor had insisted on, wanting Marguerite's ring properly documented for both insurance and historical preservation purposes. The same careful thoroughness that defined how Eleanor approached most things that mattered to her. That registration, filed nearly 3 decades earlier, had sat quietly in a shared industry database ever since, the kind of record most owners forget exists until a piece with a matching engraving or serial detail crosses the counter of a member business, at which point the system flags it automatically, prompting a verification call before any transaction proceeds. Dom had walked into Delacroix Fine Pawn 3 weeks earlier, Inez told me, and attempted to pawn the ring for $1,100, a fraction, she noted carefully, of its actual documented value, a detail I want you to sit with for a moment, because it tells you something important about the state of mind he must have been in when he walked through that door. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep. I want to describe the specific hour that followed that phone call, because it is not an hour I remember with any particular grace. I called Dom immediately, and he did not answer. I called again, and again he did not answer. I drove to his apartment, a 20-minute drive that felt considerably longer, my hands tight on the wheel the entire way, running through a version of this story that I understood, even as I constructed it, was probably wrong, and that I couldn't stop myself from constructing anyway. A version where my nephew had simply decided Eleanor's ring was worth more to him as cash than as a family heirloom. A version that made him, in my angriest imagining, someone I genuinely didn't. I drove past the cemetery on that route, the same one where Eleanor used to walk Dom among the moss-heavy oaks and half-legible headstones on Sunday afternoons, and I remember the specific, unwelcome irony of passing it in that state of mind. The place that had once represented her patient tenderness toward him, now simply a landmark on the route toward what I was afraid was going to be a confrontation neither of us could take back afterward. I gripped the wheel tighter than the drive. I rehearsed, uselessly, several different versions of what I was going to say to him, none of which felt adequate to the specific, complicated fury and grief tangled together in my chest. The traffic on Victory Drive was heavier than usual for that hour, and I remember sitting at a red light considerably longer than it should have taken, staring at the dashboard clock, counting minutes the way you count things when your mind needs somewhere concrete to land besides the actual size of what you're afraid of. By the time I reached his building, I had built, in my head, an entire narrative of betrayal so complete that the actual truth, when it finally arrived, was going to require me to tear that narrative down piece by piece and start over from something considerably more complicated and considerably harder to simply be angry about. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. I sat in my car outside his building for almost 40 minutes, and it was during that specific, furious wait that I finally called my sister Patricia, needing someone who might actually understand what I was looking at. And it was Patricia, not Dom, who finally gave me the fuller shape of what had actually happened. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. Patricia told me, her own voice unsteady, that Dom had confided in her just 2 days earlier about something he'd been carrying alone for nearly 4 months. A relationship, entirely online, with a woman he'd believed he was falling in love with. A woman named Eleanor he'd met through a financial investing app, who had, over the course of that relationship, gradually convinced him to move a portion of his savings into a cryptocurrency investment platform she claimed to have used successfully herself. I want to describe the specific, patient architecture of what Patricia was describing, because I've since learned considerably more about how these schemes actually work, and I think understanding the mechanics matters for understanding why a smart, careful young man like Dom could end up exactly where he did. Eleanor hadn't asked for money in that first month, Patricia explained. She'd simply talked for weeks about her own life, her own supposed struggles, building a slow, convincing intimacy with Dom through a stream of daily messages, photographs, voice notes recorded. He'd later learn, using technology capable of generating a convincing voice from almost nothing at all. Only once that intimacy felt solid, felt like something worth protecting, had she begun mentioning her own investment success, casually at first, an offhand comment about a platform that had changed her financial situation. Planting a seed she never once had to push directly, letting Dom's own curiosity and eventual trust do the work of asking her more about it himself. Patricia told me, too, something I hadn't fully considered until she said it, that Dom had been particularly vulnerable to exactly this kind of manufactured intimacy that year, having gone through a difficult breakup of his own the previous winter, a relationship that had ended badly enough that he'd pulled back from most of his usual social circle, spending considerably more time alone than either Patricia or I had fully registered at the time. Eleanor hadn't found a careless man. She'd found a lonely one, at precisely the specific moment his usual defenses against exactly this kind of attention were at their thinnest. A timing Patricia suspected was not coincidental at all, given how methodically these operations are known to identify and target people going through visible life transitions. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. Dom had invested at first a modest amount, watched it show impressive, entirely fabricated returns on the platform's dashboard, and had gradually over subsequent weeks been convinced to invest more. Eventually his entire savings, nearly $40,000, all of it now sitting, inaccessible behind a platform that had begun demanding additional release fees and tax clearance payments before he could withdraw any of it at all. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting in my car outside Dom's apartment, listening to Patricia explain this, understanding in real time that the fear I'd been building for 3 weeks around a story about greed had actually been a story about a young man being systematically, deliberately deceived by professional criminals who specialize in exactly this kind of slow, patient manipulation, the specific machinery of what's called a romance investment scam, engineered precisely to make its victims too ashamed to tell anyone what's actually happening to them, until it's too late to easily reverse. Patricia told me Dom had needed $1,200, one final release fee. The platform claimed would unlock his entire $40,000 balance, a specific, calculated amount designed to feel achievable, small enough to seem worth one more desperate attempt, and that Dom, having already exhausted his own available credit and too ashamed to ask his mother or me directly for money, had remembered Eleanor's ring sitting in his possession for an appraisal that had, somewhere in the preceding weeks, become the only asset he had left that he believed he could quietly, temporarily convert into cash, fully intending, Patricia said, to redeem it from the pawn shop the moment his investment finally released. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Dom finally called me back that evening, and I want to describe the specific sound of his voice, because it carried a depth of shame I had genuinely never heard from him before, not as a child navigating his parents' divorce, not even standing at Eleanor's funeral trying to hold himself together long enough to finish his eulogy. He asked if he could come over. I told him yes. And I want to be honest that I spent the hour before he arrived uncertain what I actually wanted to say to him, torn between an anger I still hadn't fully released and a grief for what he'd clearly been suffering through, alone for months, that was beginning, even in that raw hour, to outweigh the anger considerably. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table where he'd offered, 3 weeks earlier, to take the ring in for appraisal, and I noticed, before he'd said a single word, how different he looked from the confident young man who had reached for that cedar box with such easy reassurance. His shoulders had a specific curved quality, a posture I recognized from 31 years of watching students brace themselves for consequences they already knew were coming, and his hands stayed wrapped around a coffee mug he never once drank from, gripping it, I think, simply for something steady to hold on to. He told me everything, start to finish, without me having to ask more than the first question. The dating app. Eleanor, who he now understood was very likely not even a real person, possibly not even a single person, but a coordinated operation, potentially not even based in this country, running the exact same patient, manufactured intimacy on dozens or hundreds of other lonely, hopeful people simultaneously. The initial small investment, the fabricated returns designed specifically to build trust before the real demands began. The $40,000, essentially his entire adult savings, now sitting behind a wall of manufactured bureaucratic obstacles that a part of him, even now, some small, humiliated part, still wanted to believe was real. I want to describe the specific way he told it, because the telling itself mattered as much as the content. He spoke slowly, almost clinically at first, as though narrating something that had happened to someone else, a defense mechanism I recognized from watching students describe their own worst mistakes over 3 decades of teaching, a careful distance that eventually, inevitably, cracked. It cracked somewhere around the part where he described the voice notes, Elena's supposed voice telling him things no one had told him in years, and I watched my 27-year-old nephew's composure finally give way entirely, his own voice dissolving into something raw and unguarded that reminded me painfully of the 11-year-old boy who used to cry quietly in our guest room those first difficult weekends after his parents' divorce, thinking none of us could hear him through. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going. I know how it sounds, he told me, his voice breaking. I know, hearing it out loud, exactly how it sounds. I knew somewhere, probably for weeks, that something was wrong. But every time I thought about walking away, I thought about how much I'd already put in, and I told myself walking away now meant losing all of it for certain, instead of maybe getting it back if I just did one more thing they asked. And then I needed $1,200 I didn't have, and Aunt Elle's ring was sitting in my apartment, and I told myself I was just borrowing against it, that I'd have it back before you even noticed. And instead I just made everything. I want to describe the specific moment my anger finally, fully gave way, sitting across that table watching my nephew describe, through tears, exactly how a patient, professional predator had spent 4 months systematically dismantling his judgment one small, believable step at a time. I understood in that moment that I was not looking at a young man who had decided Eleanor's memory was worth less than cash. I was looking at a young man who had been so thoroughly, deliberately manipulated that pawning a family heirloom had, at the darkest point of that manipulation, felt like the only remaining option available to him. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I called Inez Delacroix the following morning, and I want to describe what she told me, because it mattered considerably for how the rest of this story unfolded. The ring, she explained, was still legally hers to hold until the standard consignment period lapsed, but because the transaction had never actually completed, her own verification system had flagged it before any money changed hands. She was fully prepared to release it back to me immediately, upon proof of the original 1994 registration, at no cost beyond the modest administrative fee her business charged for exactly this kind of verification. I drove to Broughton Street that same afternoon, Dom sitting beside me in a silence that felt, this time, considerably different from the guarded silence of the preceding 3 weeks. A silence built from genuine remorse rather than concealment. I remember the specific texture of that drive, both of us watching the storefronts pass, the old brick facades and wrought iron balconies of downtown Savannah looking, that particular afternoon, both entirely ordinary and somehow charged with a significance they hadn't carried an hour earlier. Every building simply a building, until we reached the one that mattered. Delacroix Fine Pawn occupied a narrow storefront between an antique map dealer and a shuttered candy shop, its window display a careful, curated arrangement of estate jewelry that told me, before I'd even stepped inside, that this was not the kind of pawn shop the phrase usually conjures. Inez Delacroix turned out to be a careful, precise woman in her 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a manner that suggested someone who valued efficiency over performance, who had, I would learn over the following weeks, built her entire business around exactly this kind of quiet vigilance, the specific registration system that had saved this particular ring one she'd fought to have adopted across the local Jewelers Association nearly a decade earlier, after watching too many family heirlooms disappear permanently into pawn transactions, that desperate people regretted the moment their circumstances improved. She led us to a small back office rather than conducting the exchange at the front counter, a specific kindness I recognized and appreciated, sparing Dom the visibility of the front room where 2 other customers were browsing display cases, and I watched her handle the verification paperwork with an unhurried thoroughness that told me this wasn't a woman who cut corners on the exact kind of documentation that had, 3 weeks earlier, saved Marguerite's ring from disappearing. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. She placed the ring in my palm herself, and I want to describe what it felt like, holding Marguerite's ring again after 3 weeks of not knowing where it was, running my own thumb, without quite meaning to, over the small engraved script inside the band. held, not owned. In the exact motion I had watched Eleanor make 10,000 times across 38 years. The metal felt warmer than I expected, though I understood rationally that it had simply been sitting in a climate-controlled display case rather than absorbing any specific temperature of its own. Some part of me still half expecting it to carry the memory of every hand that had touched it since it left mine. I stood there in that narrow back office on Broughton Street for what felt like a considerably longer moment than it probably actually was, Dom beside me, Inez Delacroix giving both of us the specific, professional grace of stepping back to let the moment simply exist without commentary. I understood, standing in that pawn shop, holding that ring, something about the inscription that I don't think I'd ever fully understood before that specific afternoon. That it wasn't only a sentiment about marriage, about the particular, temporary custodianship two people hold over each other's lives. It was a sentiment about everything that matters most, including, apparently, the family itself, held rather than owned, passed carefully from hand to hand, capable of being lost through nobody's fault but a predator's design, and capable, too, of being recovered, if the people who loved each other were willing to sit together in the wreckage and actually tell the truth. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Dom and I spent the following weeks working through the fuller aftermath together. I helped him file a report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, a process that Inez herself walked us through, having apparently developed, over years of watching exactly this kind of scam intersect with her business, a considerable working knowledge of the reporting mechanisms available, however slim the odds of ever recovering the actual $40,000. I remember sitting with Dom at his kitchen table one evening that week, both of us working through the specific, tedious documentation the report required, screenshots of every message exchange, transaction records from the fraudulent platform, a timeline reconstructed from 4 months of messages he'd once treasured, and now had to relive purely as evidence. I watched him wince, more than once, rereading messages from Eleanor that he'd once found genuinely moving, now visible in the cold light of hindsight as the calculated, formulaic manipulation they'd actually been. It was slow, difficult work, and I stayed with him through most of it, not because there was much I could practically contribute to the technical filing itself, but because I understood by then that being present mattered more than being useful. We met with a financial counselor together, at my insistence, not to shame Dom further, but to help him build an actual plan for rebuilding what he'd lost, one that didn't rely on the specific, desperate shortcuts that vulnerability to exactly this kind of manipulation tends to create. The counselor, a patient woman named Rosalind Ake, told us something during that first session that I've thought about often since. That the specific shame victims of these scams carry is itself part of what the schemes are engineered to produce, a deliberate design feature rather than an accidental byproduct, because shame keeps victims silent, and silence is precisely what lets the same predators continue operating undetected against the next lonely, hopeful person in their path. Rosalind worked with Dom over the following months on a specific, concrete rebuilding plan, starting with the unglamorous basics, an emergency savings fund built back from nothing, a strict monthly budget he reviewed with her every few weeks, a considerably more skeptical relationship with unsolicited investment opportunities of any kind. She also, I want to note, spent real time simply letting him talk through the emotional wreckage of the experience, understanding, as she told us both, that financial recovery and emotional recovery rarely move at the same pace, and that rushing either one to catch up with the other tends to produce worse outcomes than letting each proceed at whatever speed it actually needs. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss one. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I didn't know, sitting in Inez Delacroix's shop that afternoon holding Eleanor's ring, that the FBI report Dom eventually filed was going to connect, months later, to a considerably larger, multi-state investigation into the exact platform that had defrauded him, one that had already victimized dozens of other people across the Southeast, several of whom investigators would eventually determine had also attempted to liquidate family heirlooms in the same desperate final weeks of the scam's demands. I didn't know that Inez's registration system, the one that had saved this particular ring, was going to become, over the following year, a small but genuine piece of evidence in helping investigators understand the scam's full geographic footprint, connecting pawned items across 3 different cities to the same underlying fraud. I didn't know, either, that Inez was going to call me again, nearly 8 months after that first Monday afternoon, asking whether Dom might be willing to speak with a federal investigator directly about the specific patterns he'd noticed in Elena's messaging, patterns that had apparently started showing up in testimony from other victims across the investigation's growing case file, a specific kind of unwitting expertise Dom had never wanted and now found himself in a position to offer other frightened, ashamed people navigating the exact same nightmare he'd survived. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, nearly a year removed from that Monday afternoon phone call, is that the ring on my dresser tonight carries a different kind of weight than it did before all of this happened, not a lesser weight, but a fuller one. It still holds Eleanor, the specific, unconscious motion of her thumb across that engraved script. 38 years of a marriage I still measure every ordinary day against. But it holds something else now too, the specific, terrifying fragility of how easily even the most carefully guarded inheritance can nearly slip away, not through malice, but through the patient, professional cruelty of strangers who make a business out of exploiting exactly the kind of loneliness and shame that keeps good people silent until it's almost too late. Dom is doing better now, considerably better, though I want to be honest that better in this particular story doesn't mean the $40,000 ever came back. It didn't, and investigators told us, gently early in the process, that recovery in cases like his is rare enough that we shouldn't build our hopes around it. What came back instead was something I think Dom needed even more than the money: a genuine, rebuilt trust in his own judgment, hard-won through months of therapy and Rosalind's patient financial counseling, and a specific, deliberate openness with the people who love him that simply hadn't existed in his life before that Monday afternoon forced it into being. He calls Patricia now, he told me recently, whenever something in his life starts to feel too heavy to carry quietly, a habit he built specifically because he understood, finally, exactly how much 4 months of silence had cost him. He calls me too, more often than he used to, small ordinary calls that have nothing urgent behind them at all, just a nephew checking in on his uncle the way he used to check in on his aunt. And I think, listening to his voice on those calls, about how close we came to losing something we didn't even fully understand we were risking, not just a ring, but the specific, patient trust between 2 people who'd already survived one shared grief together and very entirely different kind of loss go unspoken between them until it was too late to repair. Dom wears a small tattoo now, on his forearm, 3 words in the same script style as the ring's own inscription, a private reminder. He told me of the afternoon he learned that shame kept alone grows considerably heavier than shame finally spoken out loud. Held, not owned. I understand that sentence now, in more ways than Eleanor or Marguerite ever intended it, and I suspect I'll keep understanding it in new ways for as long as I have that ring, and that nephew, both of them, to hold. I visit the cemetery myself now, some Sunday afternoons, the same paths Eleanor used to walk with Dom when he was a boy, learning which of her stories were true and which were simply hers to invent. I don't tell her stories to anyone there. I just walk, the ring back where it belongs on my dresser at home, and I think about the specific, complicated grace of a family that nearly lost something irreplaceable and found its way back to it anyway, through a stranger's careful vigilance, a sister's honest confession, and a nephew's willingness, finally, to stop carrying his shame entirely alone. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. And if you or someone you love may be involved in an online relationship that's asked for money, especially for cryptocurrency investments or release fees, please know that this is one of the most common and devastating scams operating today, and that reaching out to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center or a trusted family member is a genuine, courageous step, however ashamed it might feel in the moment. You don't have to carry it alone. Thanks for being here.